Welcome back to Success in RPGs. Today I want to talk about something really interesting that started back in March when Wizards of the Coast made changes to the 2014 books. Those are the books you may have in your hands right now. And they did it to the digital versions of those books in D&D Beyond. And I want to talk about what's in those changes because we can learn a lot from them. Wizards of the Coast made inclusivity and sensitivity passes to look through the material and make changes. And by looking at what has changed, we can learn from that effort. Today on Success in RPGs. So you may be curious to learn a little bit about these changes. Here's kind of how this came to be. Back in March of 2023, I discussed with co-host Sean Merwin on the Mastering Dungeons podcast how there had been a number of changes recently that didn't have errata. At the time, it was after the Hadozi incident where Wizards of the Coast had put in very problematic language in their books, and then they fixed that. But when they made the fix in the D&D Beyond to the Spelljammer book, they also went ahead and made a bunch of other changes. Things like how the glide worked for the Hadozi species. And when they did this, they did not create an errata document. It just sort of happened, right? And so we were talking on the show about how this was kind of like a stealth change where they had done it and not told anyone. And so you just had to sort of figure it out. And eventually, when they reprinted the book, well, then you might see it in the physical form. But even in the digital form, you might not be aware it's changed until one day you look at it. Someone could have printed out a character sheet, and then you look on the D&D Beyond, and it doesn't match up, right? So we were talking about this, and a listener contacted me after the show and said, hey, I was listening to this. Well, I took a look at D&D Beyond, and I found a bunch of other changes in the core book. So not in something like Spelljammer, but in the 2014, the original 5e, Player's Handbook, DMG, and Monster Manual. And this person shared with me a comparison that was possible because D&D Beyond publishes on a different schedule and sort of through a similar but different process between the D&D Beyond website and the mobile app. So when you take those two and compare them, you can find changes in between the delay. Now, you won't see them now because all the changes I'm going to talk about, they've already been adjusted between the two platforms. But if you have an original printing of the book, or I think any printing actually will work because these changes probably haven't made it into a print version. And maybe they won't since there'll be 2024 versions of the books. But if you look at the physical copy of the book and you look at D&D Beyond, either on the mobile app or on the website, you will see these changes that I'm going to share with you today. And the point of looking at these changes is that we can learn from them as creators, as DMs, as designers, or even as fans who want to understand ways that the language can improve. And language is always improving and evolving in all of our role-playing games. Wizards of the Coast is one of the biggest companies. Well, they're the biggest role-playing game company out there. So we want to learn from what they're doing. They can often lead or set the stage. In April, when I went to the D&D Summit, which I was fortunate to attend, I said to them, hey, I noticed these changes. Could you share those changes with everybody? I mean, I'll do it, but I'd rather you do it. And they said that they planned on communicating what their inclusivity and sensitivity policies were, but they haven't done so, and it's been 7 months. So I want to go ahead and share this because I believe that by looking at these changes, creators can learn. And I want to say you may not agree with every single one of these changes. That's totally fine, right? All of us are going to be in a state of evolution as to where we are in any one particular issue. So a good example is orcs, right? There are a lot of GMs that I talk to that say, hey, look, I just want to murderize orcs left and right. What's wrong with that? And that's fine. I think having an open mind and thinking through issues, looking into the history of orcs, looking into what different people say, that's helpful. If you approach it with an open mind, you think about it, then you can begin to sort of look at which pieces of that equation you're kind of ready to take in and why and how. And some issues are much more important than others, right? We don't have actual orcs in our world, so it's a little different than if you're feeling different about some of the other issues that are far more important, far real and tangible to people, right? Inclusivity in this game, in D&D and in RPGs as a whole, have been responsible for the enormous growth of role-playing games. As role-playing games become more accessible, more inclusive, more representative of all of us, then we see each other there, right? Okay, so hopefully that's clear. And I invite everybody to look at this not as a list of things that you must believe in or that you have to 100% agree with the particular change that Wizards of the Coast has made, but rather an opportunity to learn from these texts and consider them and think about them. And you may find, as I have on things like orcs, that your thought process evolves over time and you come to accept a different place than when you started on a particular day. That's growth. That's good, right? We all want to evolve. So we're going to take a look at the actual changes, and you'll find these are also going to be on alphastream.org in a blog post, which I'll be showing you here as a preview form before I publish it. Looking at these changes, you'll be able to take a look at the actual images that capture what's called a differential file, a diffie file, that takes the comparison between the two sites and tags the changes that are in place. Okay, so here we are on my website, alphastream.org. Again, you can find all of this here and read through the article at your own pace, think through all the different topics, look at the examples, even save it as a PDF or whatever. If you're a designer, you do a lot of homebrew work and you want to kind of change up your language, then this can serve as a guide for that. So I share in this article a little bit about that story of that I just told you about the Creator Summit and how the changes came to be. And I make a point here that this has been in place for months, right? This is not something that just happened and shock and alarm can be expected in the industry. In fact, anybody looking at the core books on D&D Beyond, you've been looking at these changes for months, right? Since at least March, depending on which of the two platforms you use, but several months. There's been, I don't think anyone has noticed, right? Is the reality of this. Maybe a few people have noticed a thing or two. And that makes sense to me because a lot of these changes are subtle things. They're not like super obvious, like, oh yeah, they're, the books were telling us to murder our families. No, they weren't doing anything that wild. But just like problems can be subtle, solutions can be subtle too. And these changes are important even if they're subtle and even if they don't get noticed all the time. And so I'm going to go through the topics. I took all the changes that we found in the files and I grouped them into topics and showed, the actual examples of what's changed. It's important to note that this is all in transition, meaning that what you see today may not be what Wizards uses in the 2024 books. The field of sensitivity and inclusivity changes and evolves over time. So we will see certainly over time changes to these. You can't take this as a guide that's static. This is something that evolves, but at least it helps you see where the thought process was early this year for Wizards of the Coast and their sensitivity and inclusivity team and their editorial team. All right, so the first topic here that I've grouped is issues of savagery and civilization. And this can be something that ties into larger topics like decolonization of games, which seeks to address how in both fiction and nonfiction writing, we often portray the non-Western cultures, the non-urban areas as lesser. Right? The cities are evolved and intelligent and progressive when they're just murdering people in different ways, right? And there are good and bad to everything, regardless of where you live, where you grew up. So trying to address that language of how we discuss what is civilization, what is savagery, is often done by removing the words like savage, that are made to describe things. And none of this is about removing your fun, right? So I like playing barbarians. I like DMing barbarians. I like exploring the wilderness. I like going to small villages. But the language we use can make that experience really cool without any of the harmful part of it. And so a lot of it, this isn't about removing things from the game. It's about painting with a different brush, if you will. And everything here below, you're going to see this little blue box reminds you in the website that everything you see, the text that's in yellow, the line that's in yellow is the original line. The line that's in green is the new line, the revision of the text. And in red is what was removed and green is what was added. So we can see in the Dungeon Master's Guide, they say where they confront savage giants, ferocious hydras, etc., and they change that word savage to brutal, right? Or in another example, they change savage raiders to merciless raiders. And so what we can see here is this thought process of removing that descriptor and using a descriptor that's more accurate for what we're trying to say, right? Well, what are we trying to say by savage? Well, savage has a lot of connotations that we're actually not trying to say. So let's go to what we're really trying to say, right? They are brutal, they're merciless, they're ruthless. And if you're a creator, whether you publish or for your own home creations, this is something you can kind of put in your to-do list, right? Like, hey, when I'm going to talk about how these things are, and I might have used the word savage, I can instead think of brutal, merciless, ruthless, right? Things like that. We also see here this case about a barbarian horde, and it gets changed to an invading horde. In some cases, horde actually gets removed. We'll see below. The monster manual has a bunch of other changes, and a lot of times the simplest approach to this kind of language is just remove the word. The word is often an additional thing carrying all of this problematic weight and isn't really needed. So they say dwarves and other civilized folk who might be friends or rivals. And here they change it to say dwarves and other folk who might be friends or rivals. You didn't actually need that word there, so you can often just prune it, and the meaning of it still works, right? You don't need to emphasize that dwarves are somehow civilized, right? What is civilizing? And it carries that larger connotation. Same thing here. They're talking about the races of goblinoids, saying almost as numerous. They just simply remove, but far more savage and brutal and almost uniformly evil. Just take that out. And if you need to address it, do so in specific ways for the individuals, the groups that you're talking about, rather than just painting with a broad picture like that. Here again, a removal. In this case, a swap, civilized for settled, and then violent instead of savage, and then just removing a piece about quagos where they're not always the brutal underdark denizens they are today. You can just remove that. It doesn't really add a lot. But you can see the kind of reading that the sensitivity and inclusivity team is doing and how they address these issues and what they pull out of here. The player's handbook as well talks about adventurers heading back to civilization to rest. Just call it their home base, right? A fierce warrior who can enter battle rage. You don't have to say of primitive background when you're discussing about something like a barbarian, right? This one is really interesting. And some of these, it's easier when you're on the website. You'll be able to click on the image and make it larger. Discussing the barbarian, saying, take pride in how their civilized ways set them apart from animals, as if denying one's own nature was a mark of superiority, right? They're talking about what people who aren't barbarians feel like. To a barbarian, though, and so they just changed this to take pride in their settled ways, as if denying one's connection to nature were a mark of superiority, right? Same concept, the game's the same, but you're using better language for it. And there are a number of other examples here about that kind of topic. So I'm not going to go over every single example. I think you get the point here. Orcs have had a number of changes in the monster manual, from savage raiders to burly raiders. I don't know, the burly is the same connotation, but it's better than savage. And they remove the end pillagers and stooped postures, low foreheads, piggish faces. They remove that out. Partly because what this is trying to do is sort of make them as being stupid, right? And we'll see a number of things that address that later in this document. And you can look at some other examples as well, but I think we've talked a fair bit about the sort of savagery, brutality kind of aspect. And then I mentioned hordes, so they did change this hordes of orcs to be humanoid hordes. I think that's interesting in that they are trying to not connote this sort of rampaging anti-civilization thing as being just like a blanket of all pieces, right? So interesting. And I think actually this failed to catch this thing maybe, but it changed from ogres. Looks like it changed the ogres away to just monsters. Another topic. So let's go to our second topic, which is madness, insanity, and crazy. All of these terms have a larger connotation these days around mental health issues. And so we want to step away from these sort of terms to describe situations where foes are evil. And so we're just painting madness as evil or corruption or something like that. We want to step away from using crazy to describe something that's incomprehensible as a situation. or madness as a loss of control of one's mind because of magic or something like that. So we can see an example in the DMG. Again, sometimes the easiest thing is to just remove it. So you're talking about mad necromancers, just becomes necromancers. And we were already afterwards discussing what they were, corrupt purveyors of human flesh. We don't need to throw in that extra piece that has this mental health connotation, right? And then we sometimes change things by swapping the words. So we can see here, pandemonium is a plane of madness. We just say of overwhelming chaos, right? And further describing pandemonium, it says, driven mad by the incessant winds. And we just talk about the incessant winds have driven many to delirium, right? So just describe its confusion, or it's a lack of being able to perceive your environment correctly, right? Describe whatever it is that it is instead of using the term. Insane wizard becomes villainous wizard. Crazy becomes foolhardy. Go insane with fear. You're overcome by fear, right? So those kinds of examples. The D&G has a number of references as well that we can look at. A mad person is simply just removed. Or I think they swap it for a prophet, because that's really what they're trying to talk about, right? A herald, a town crier, a mad person was a prophet, right? And you could find other ways to describe it, but we get the point here. A soothsayer instead of a mad woman standing on a street corner. And here's a good one. In a typical campaign, characters aren't driven mad by the horrors they face and the carnage they inflict is changed to, in many campaigns, little focus is placed on the mental and emotional impact of the dangers characters face, right? Very similar. The overall concept is similar, but we are changing this and cleaning it up so it doesn't have those problems to it that are going to impact many people, especially people who are dealing with somebody in their family or their own selves with mental health issues, right? And there are a number of others here on this topic of cosmic horror instead of risk of insanity. Insane becomes bizarre. Writings of raving lunatics, incomprehensible scrawlings. Tormented instead of raving. Deranged is removed. The mind drifts to a place beyond normal madness. Just the mind imagines this reality. And so you can take a look at these others. Here's one good one in the Player's Handbook. A lunatic driven mad is a cultist tormented by. Great. It still carries the same concept. There are a number of things about bioessentialism. So this is where we are describing characteristics related to culture or individual experiences, and we're assigning them to all members of the species and sort of saying, yeah, this is just like the way biology works. All these creatures come out this way. The way we might say, the bird is green to settle, to fade into the forest or something like that. And so we have language here about how ogres, when they mate with other species, what happens. And so you can take a look at how this has tried to still convey where an ogrelon comes from, but without the sort of bioessentialist piece to it. And sometimes things are just taken out. Like the idea, one of the things that can be a problem is this idea of people breeding other people has historical problems as well. So breeding Quagos is just recruiting and training Quagos, right? We don't need this in the fantasy. It is not critical to the fantasy of the story. Let's just change what's happening here, right? Racial purity and comparisons of lesser. So there's been a number of problems with the language here. There have been many improvements over the years in RPGs. But here, beholders have this concept around racial purity of their kind. And so that is changed to say that they just simply consider some things as flaws, and they vary greatly in physical forms, right? And then they conflict over that, right? So they kind of all have their ideas, and that creates conflict. That's different than saying racial purity, right? Let's get that out of there. Drow fear and shun the Dryaders, holding them in lower esteem than slaves. They just fear and despise Dryaders, right? There was already text that explained the why of it. We'll talk about this later as well, but Dark Elves get swapped for Drow, so that is interesting. And we'll talk more about that concept of dark. All right, next topic is low intelligence as a characteristic of a species. It ties into that bioessentialist attitude or concept, that the bioessentialist theme. Here we swap out anything that really says that the creatures are stupid, dim-witted, things like that. So they're changed to be incurious. Here, dim-witted is taken out. This thing about there's a text here is as savages eating and breeding in the hills like animals, they have never needed to adapt and change, so their minds and emotions remain simple and undeveloped. Right. So this simply changes it to saying that they, through the environment, are not needing to adapt and change. Right. Much shorter, and take out all those problems in the text that make you read it and go, what are you telling me here? Quoto were simple creatures never meant to endure the oppressive mental whatever. They're just unable to endure the oppressive mental force that the Elithids put upon them, right? You don't have to characterize them, just state the sort of historical thing that happened. And we can see some additional text here. It's easier if you click on it on the website, but savage, degenerate, changed to violent and ever hungry, simple-minded to single-minded. And then some issues around gender. And so this is something that has been evolving a lot, right? If you look at the earliest examples of D&D or other RPGs, the GM is always referred to as male, not always, but often in most texts. And we've advanced to saying things, hey, let's just say they instead of using male or female or swapping. I think third edition, swap between the genders. But now we realize that, they is better because, well, male and female can be limiting as well. Not everybody sees themselves that way, and your role can change. And so by addressing gender differently, we can be more inclusive to everybody who's reading our work. And there's text here that talks to the DM saying, or to the player, you can play a male or female character without gaining any special benefits or hindrances. And so they changed that to say, you choose your character's sex, gender, and sexual orientation, right? You make the choice of who you are. Think about how your character does or does not conform to the broader culture. Think about how your character interacts with the broader culture's expectations. So just some cleanup of that language as we see it evolve there. There's a case here, example of a male drow cleric and defining traditional gender divisions of drow society. We see here Corellon, I think it's followers of Corellon, see themselves as embodying their deity's transcendence of sex and gender, and some elves' connection to the deity allows them to change their sex. So just slight cleanup, right? This is the kind of thing that you want to look at and parse and take an example at. And there are a number of things here that really are kind of, these issues can be very hard to parse. And so we want a representation that reflects society. The language evolves in these kinds of situations because this receives so much attention. You want to work with a sensitivity consultant who can get you up to date on the newest way of approaching it. Just in the past 5 years that I've been writing, as I write about, for example, transgender characters or same-sex partnerships, the language we use has changed in just the past 5 years. So you really want to not only have good intentions around your writing, but work with people who can help you refine that language to the correct way to say it today, because it changes as we think through these challenges and try to make it better. One other thing here is stat blocks and the language around stat blocks. D&D tends to use it for monsters like beholders or mind flayers that don't have a clear sense of gender. And then avoids using they for them, just sort of uses it. And the construct is obvious, but even for a beholder or a mind flayer, this it as sort of being beyond the concept of gender. And other gaming companies do it differently. For example, MCDM and many others use they when discussing monsters, regardless of whether they have a gender or not, just always use they. And then you don't have a situation where it sometimes doesn't fit, right? I like that a lot. Mike Shea and Scott Fitzgerald Gray and I used the same approach for our Forge of Foes book, using they when discussing monsters. Disabilities are becoming finally a big center of attention. So, when we say that their madness blinding them to the fact that, right? We say instead a god unaware to the fact that the aboleth is this, that, and the other. that's just one example that I noted here, but thinking through that when you're using a term in your writing that is a disability, but you're not describing a disability, right? You're not discussing blindness. You're using it as a, you know, they were deaf to the fact that something like that, right? Like then we want to use a different word to connote that, hey, they failed to understand that this, that, or the other, right? Fat, there are a few references that I noted here that have been removed where the word does not add meaning. So hill giants, right? This is the thing in fifth edition that the hill giants kind of eat and want to be as big as possible, the tallest and fattest giant. They just say the biggest giant that can still move about. Troglodyte worshippers, to become fat, well-fed, they just well-fed. The DMG has an honor system, and it directly speaks to Asian culture, right? This ability fits well in a setting inspired by Asian cultures, such as Karator and the Forgotten Realms. That is changed to just simply say the honor ability is useful in any campaign that revolves around orders of knights or other warriors who adhere to a formal code. We don't have to bring the world into it, and probably shouldn't for anything that we're trying to say is real world cultural, because real world cultures are really complicated. And if you try to just say that a game mechanic somehow captures that, you're probably going to fail and probably going to offend people from many cultures, not just that one culture. Phylactery. I think Pathfinder removed Phylactery entirely. But here we see that Wizards has changed the description of what it is. From traditionally an amulet in the shape of a small box to any item possessing interior space. Maybe that's part of a cleanup there to try to prevent it from being a real world analog. We'll see. Again, this is one of these issues to watch. Maybe Wizards decides in 2024 to remove it, or at some point beyond that. Slavery is an incredibly complex issue. So let's talk about this just briefly. I actually am surprised that Wizards even retains uses of it. But speaking to folks that are a little more active and that are in the field of sensitivity and inclusivity, it's my understanding from what they say that there is a specific way that you can address slavery. For example, the difference between saying that you were a slave or that you were enslaved is very different. So I personally in my products would remove any mention of slavery. I don't think it's essential to any RPG experience. And speaking to other folks that I trust, they find it just takes away from any fun they're going to have in a game when we even just bring up the topic. But Wizards for now has made a number of changes to how it's explained. Sometimes slavery is just removed, right? They become servants, or it's just taken out. Quarters for enslaved creatures instead of slave pens. So this is, again, an example where it's still there as a concept. And I personally don't particularly care for that. But, again, we defer in opinions of how we address it. By the way, this comes up a lot where folks will say, especially when we're talking about the Darkson world, isn't it okay when the heroes are ending slavery? And yes, of course, it's good to do good heroic things, but just the concept of it will turn off a lot of players. Why will impact players? So why impact players, right? We're all here to have fun. Just take it out of there. My opinion. Opinions evolve. And so we can see other examples here of how the language has changed to change and address this topic. There is a fair amount of it here. So you can look at all these different examples. Similarly, the word dark has been changed in a couple of places. A dark ritual becomes a vile ritual, right? Because this idea that somehow darkness, which can be linked to skin, can be a problem. And so we can easily make a swap or even sometimes just remove it and the language is better, right? And that's what really we're here to do, is create the best language we can. So I have a few final thoughts there on the blog, but really here, I hope the overall intent is clear. These changes that were made, I think, are really good. I look forward to, I hope that Wizards will follow this up with sharing their document and their guidance on how they approach this. I really, if anybody from Wizards is listening, please, we'd love to see and learn from what you do. And if you're from another RPG company, be great to see your guidance documents too, right? Like, I think the more that people share information, the better you are. So if you're a creator and you can be in a community of creators and discuss these kinds of topics, we will all learn from it. We won't always agree. That's okay. Because from not agreeing comes looking at issues in different ways, discussing it, and learning from it. So let's try to have more of a conversation out there. I think the more that industries can share this kind of these teachings, these learnings, we can all advance as a hobby, end up with a better place to be. And that's a continuous improvement that we've been seeing for decades. So thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Success in RPGs. My thank you to the Patreons that keep this show going and create a wonderful community on our Discord to discuss great topics like this and improve our games. I'll see you next time on Success in RPGs.